Imagine a world where zero waste goes to landfill, a world where recycling is a widespread practice. In this world, current pressing concerns such as landfills being filled in the next 20 years or carbon dioxide emissions reaching record levels would no longer be a concern. This will change the world, not just for everyone in this room or for local businesses, but for our children and our children's children. It is in this context that the Sustainable Energy Association of Singapore exists. Through representing your member businesses and facilitating interactions with key stakeholders, SEAS aims to guide everyone on the process towards sustainable management. Good afternoon, we are Eva Consulting, and I'm George Passos, Shreen Dillon, Kieran Singh, and Johnny Zhang. Our team has analysed your relationships with key stakeholders and developed strong value propositions to answer one key question. How can you achieve sustainable waste management practices and facilitate the adoption of these practices throughout broader Asia? Our strategy involves two key components. First, targeting zero waste policy through recycle maximisation, and second, through enhancing renewability through promoting waste to energy processes. These strategies together will deliver two key KPIs. First, reducing the amount of disposed waste by 90% by 2030, and second, elevating SEAS and Singapore to a thought leadership position in the sustainable space throughout the broader Asian region. So how do we come to these key recommendations? Our team looked at the traditional waste management process and identified strong inefficiencies that existed at a few key segments. First, Shreen will discuss how to overcome traditional issues regarding separation of contaminants at source. She will recommend doing this through both a legislative approach and through education campaigns to overcome structural and behavioural barriers. Kieran will then discuss the environmental benefits and the financial viability of biorenewable processes to replace traditional disposal methods such as incineration and landfill. These strategies together will allow SEAS to make a massive change to the sustainable energy industry, both in Singapore and in broader Asia. And I'll now pass it on to Shreen to discuss the first part of this vision, which is the recycling component.
So we all know that Singaporeans love their makan. But what happens to this food waste and other waste once it has been disposed of? Currently, only 63% of households recycle their waste, but that is not enough. We envision that 100% of households should recycle their waste and work towards reducing waste that goes to landfill. Instead, this waste should be channeled into recyclable products and energy sources. However, there are currently two barriers to this process. Firstly, the waste being thrown out by households is contaminated. This is because of behavioural, and only 13% of this waste is recoverable. This is because of behavioural barriers that prevent households from effectively disposing of their waste. Firstly, there's no incentive to dispose of their waste, as it is more convenient to simply put it all together. Secondly, there are significant knowledge gaps that prevent people from knowing how to correctly recycle their waste. Therefore, SEAS must come into this space, leverage their position in order to be able to engage all of the stakeholders and work towards reducing landfill waste and working towards that zero waste target. This is firstly done through approaching the government to create a national approach to waste disposal through an enforceable scheme, and complementing this through an educational approach by having an iRecycle mobile application that targets households and brings them on board. Firstly, with the legislative scheme, we have identified through our analysis that behavioural approaches on their own are ineffective. We share the idea that a legislative approach would be more effective in compelling households to come on board with this effort. We envision that the traditional legislative schemes of Singapore can be leveraged off, and following a successful model in countries such as Hong Kong and Taiwan and Korea, we can push for mandatory separation of household waste in order to be able to immediately decrease waste that is going into landfill and lowering costs for waste collectors. This is an enforceable scheme that is enforced by public waste collection companies, who then can impose fines for non-compliance, ensuring that there is sufficient enforceability of these measures. Secondly, to complement this, we have identified a significant knowledge gap and the desire from households to know more about how to better recycle. Therefore, we envision that governments should create an app that firstly educates and secondly energizes consumers to come on board with this effort. In terms of educating, we have envisioned the idea of a barcode scanner that will ensure that consumers know how to dispose of their recyclable products. This will reduce waste contamination and increase the participation of households in this scheme. Secondly, we will energise younger consumers who have the best chance of changing waste recycling practices through an interactive campaign and an interactive game on the application. This ensures that recycling will become a process as simple as putting on a seatbelt and be ingrained into the culture. So where do Cs fit in this process? Firstly, they can lobby governments, and complement this by advising member companies about the new opportunities in this space and the way they can change their business model to cope with this legislative reform. Secondly, through the mobile application, Cs is able to supply the vision and the overarching goal in terms of waste management, as well as providing member companies insights and inputs to be able to be informing consumers better. So Cs can leverage their prime position in this market and deliver benefits to take the benefits to each of the stakeholders. Firstly, for government, this reduces waste and CO2 emissions and is in line with their sustainable blueprint plans. Secondly, for waste collectors, there are reduced costs. And finally, for consumers, this instills a social responsibility approach that can then be taken into the intergenerational equity space as our younger generations are now coming on board with the scheme, and in the long term, the target of achieving zero waste can be achieved. However, in the shorter term, this can be complemented by alternatives to incineration, which Kieran will now walk you through.
Every year, up to 90% of waste in Singapore is either incinerated or landfilled. If this process continues, Singapore will require an additional landfill within 20 years that is approximately the size of Sentosa Island. Therefore, it is imperative for Singapore to adopt sustainable practices to retain its position as a sustainable leader in the Asia region. We've identified that the current process of incineration is inefficient. Now, there are two reasons why this is the case. Firstly, it emits greenhouse gases such as methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide, and in addition to which, it comes at the expense of the energy that is not captured through the process. Therefore, we suggest looking towards alternative solutions, primarily biorenewable conversion, that is biogas, and biomass conversion from the waste that is already collected. Ultimately, we see that Cs plays a fundamental role in this process as it has the technical expertise to set up waste collecting agents such as Veolia to provide the technical expertise that they currently lack to allow them to reduce their costs of labour for the manual separation of waste that they currently incur. Over time, Cs will allow waste collectors in Singapore to ultimately adopt biorenewable solutions such as biogas and biomass processes. We identified 3 ways this could happen. First, downstream integration. Secondly, open tender. And lastly, a co-ownership model. We recognize that downstream integration is not feasible because Singapore lacks the land available to set up additional operations with companies such as Veolia. Therefore, our focus is on open tender as well as co-ownership. However, we've decided to explore open tender. The primary reasons for this is that it minimizes the operational risk for the government, in addition to which it provides a competitive environment for companies to bid against one another, and in the process of increasing the competitive intensity, improve the overall innovation of solutions that they present. And hopefully they can present co-generational and tri-generational waste plants in the future, from which we can generate mass amounts of waste energy from electricity, heat, and also cooling. In terms of the actual bidders, we identified 3 particular companies who represent the interests of the tender process. We'll focus primarily on Energea because they are an international player in this space. They have over 1,600 applications of their technology, which has had proven success, and as such, they are in prime position to uptake the tender process. Therefore, potential bidders are capable and are ready to proceed with a tender solution that incorporates the government. as you can see, we look towards the financial analysis that focuses on the capital investment per kilowatt of plants versus the waste utilization. As you can see, in the worst case scenario, we see a 6-year payback period, whereas in the neutral case, we are looking towards more of a 3-year period. This is highly competitive with current processes, and the assumptions that we've made are actually quite conservative. The takeaway here is that incineration process as a disposable solution is not sustainable. Focusing on biomass and other sustainable solutions will be the focus of the future. And it is important that the government in Singapore recognizes this through the tender process and current market participants to ultimately achieve a better tomorrow. My colleague Johnny will now focus on the impacts of our recommendations on Sea's domestic and international stakeholders.
So to ensure the success of the strategies moving forward, it's useful to consider the impact of these strategies on key stakeholders, and secondly, on Sea's ability to expand these operations overseas. So starting with the key stakeholders, Seas must understand the key stakeholders' key concerns in terms of what drives their success and pair it with Sea's own vision. So take, for example, PwCs. These organisations are primarily concerned with the financial impact of any strategy decision they make. As a result, Seas can propose to PwCs that if they were to get on board with the vision, then essentially they can reduce costs in areas of, say, for example, sorting of rubbish, as well as the incineration costs. By bringing this towards the stakeholders, Seas is able to create strong buy-in from these stakeholders whilst proposing its vision moving forward. So now that the stakeholders are on board, so how can Seas be able to transmit its facilitating skills to the rest of the Asian market? So Seas has, through the strategies, is able to facilitate some landmark and complex and some of the most innovative transactions in the waste management industry. So through this, Seas can take this skill to other Asian markets and then pair up potential suppliers of waste management solutions with the gap in the market and the opportunities. The markets that we identified are South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Overall, it's not Seas that creates the most impact in the market. Rather, it's Seas members and also its stakeholders. So from here, you can see that Seas is able to create capabilities in its stakeholders and members. And through this, the stakeholders become essentially thought leaders of the waste management industry in Asia. Being Singaporean companies, this creates Singapore and propels it as a regional knowledge hub for waste management solutions. And what's really special about Singapore is that it's able to facilitate these companies' longevity and success because it provides the capital market services, the infrastructure from a business and legal sense, as well as the connectivity geographically with the rest of Asia. So with every strategy comes a number of key risks that may ultimately create adverse effects on the success of any strategy. We have detailed these risks in your slide packs, and we're happy to walk through the mitigation strategies in the Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. With any strategy, Seas must be able to identify the implementation timeline and identify which key stakeholders must be engaged at each stage of the timeline. So take targeting zero waste, our first strategy. Through this strategy, at the first step, the two key stakeholders are the government and the PwCs. What Seas must ensure is that these stakeholders are on board through the changing the legislative process, as well as the R&D process in terms of the mobile app. With the second strategy, energising waste, what Seas must do is essentially engage PwC and allow them to understand what they need, the opportunity, and then pair them up with the government's providers. I'd like to now pass on to George to conclude and give the next steps.
Today our team has demonstrated clear value propositions that you can deliver to your key stakeholders in order to achieve these two targets. Firstly, improving the recycling levels throughout the whole of Singapore, and secondly, through facilitating a process of waste to energy management. So what can our firm offer you tomorrow in order to get these strategies off the road? First, we recommend preparing draft submissions surrounding the benefits of this separation legislation in order to begin motivating the government. Second is to engage the government in order to set strict waste to energy milestones. And the final thing is to register for the 2014 Global Cleantech 100 Summit in order to facilitate cross-border networking and begin extending CSER's reach. We look forward to the opportunity of working with you. Thank you, Share, and we welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. I'm a bit puzzled. How did you decide on South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong as the next step? Why not Malaysia, Indonesia, which is a bit more close to home?
Well, the interesting thing with these three markets is they have the correct, I guess, legislative requirements, regulatory requirements. So for each of these markets, there are requirements that people, for example, Taiwan, to separate waste in three categories. In Hong Kong, the government is actually engaged with the commercial and industrial food-related businesses and set a number of milestone steps in order to achieve their waste targets. So with these jurisdictions, the thing that they don't have, after producing the waste, for each of these jurisdictions, there's not a well-established waste to energy solution that's in place at the moment. So where C steps in, is it's able to facilitate essentially bridging the gap between those providers of the solution and this opportunity in the market, and hence we've chosen these three jurisdictions.
All these three countries are technologically and from a societal development quite far. So is this not preaching to the converted? So don't you get more mileage if you can bring just Indonesia up to par?
Another reason is that with those three jurisdictions, there are less risks involved with entering these markets. So as you can see, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan, they're all very well established in terms of the legal infrastructure involved. Entering into a Thailand market, where Singaporean business environment may be unfamiliar with targeting particular, say, partnerships, may not be the first move. So essentially, these are the next steps, and should target these first due to the opportunity presented, as well as the lack of legal risks when entering the markets.
My question is probably a little bit on how you came up with the impact assessment. You had one of the slides, we had the financial, environmental, and influence metrics, and some of the numbers you had there on negative and positive impact. Could you explain a little bit how you came up with this analysis, please?
Sure. So firstly, financial, environmental, and influence metrics. We thought about what each of these stakeholders, what is the key that they want to achieve out of whatever project they enter into. So for the financial impact, when you pair with PwCs or individuals, what they care mainly is about the financial impact. PwCs are publicly listed companies, and they have a duty to their shareholders to maximize profit. How we got these savings is essentially looked at the balance sheet of the Cs that had the breakdown, so rather income statement of the PwCs that had a breakdown of the expenses, looked to, number one, their cost of incineration, and number two, to the cost of essentially staff cost, where they're using staff to separate each of these things manually, and adjusting for a reduction in the overall, I guess, contaminated waste in order to achieve the 20%. The 3% decrease on the bottom side is essentially where, if nothing was done, if there's no uptake of these strategies, what will happen is essentially that the market will continue, or individuals continue to, say, contaminate waste products, and there'll be an increased fee on the PwC side when they're assessing, looking at the cost associated with kind of separation. In terms of environment, the base goal for non-waste output, that's a goal set by the Singaporean government, and at the moment it's between 60 to 70%. With the introduction of the zero waste policy, obviously there's always going to be waste. So 90%, the top end, refers to when waste is either being recycled or when it's also being incinerated, or in this case, with the new technologies coming on board, the waste energy production, and that captures the 90% better.
Thanks for the presentation. So going back to the targeting zero waste, what's different? What's new here? I see the enforcement and the education aspects, but it seems to be stuff I've heard before. Why this? Tell me more. I'm not really getting it.
So what's, I guess, novel about this strategy is that we are taking both of those things, the enforcement and the education, and we are building a long-term culture of ingraining this into the Singaporean mindset. I guess we've identified that currently there are these schemes. There is a behavioural influence, but there is no real unifying effort and regulatory scheme to mobilise everyone to work together. We are building a culture in which people will care about waste management and which the leaders of tomorrow, the younger generation, will come on board with this scheme. The difference here is that we've accompanied the legislative measures with an educational program to achieve maximum impact, because we want to engage them on both compelling to their ability to uptake this scheme and also providing a way in which they can learn more about why they're doing these measures as well.
In addition to this, in case the zero waste policy that we recommended doesn't go completely to plan, we also have a mitigation, which is to reduce supply side waste through something similar to an extended producer responsibility, model of the United Kingdom system. This is because currently in Singapore, 1/3 of household waste comes from packaging. And the way we envision this system to work, similar to the UK, is producers are required to limit the amount of packaging they produce, as well as hit certain recycling and recovery targets, which can also help achieve that zero waste target.
So let me come back to the household waste piece and then touch on what you've raised. Currently in Singapore, we're at a paltry 13% of household recycling is recoverable, like 13%. So we're saying by the enforcement, so having mandatory separation, and by having an education program, that's going to bump us up to close to, what's the target?
The target is to have 100% of household waste be usable.
By what time frame?
About 2030, in line with zero waste policy.
2030. Okay. So we've got a ways to go. I'm still skeptical on this, because if I look at the one of the key parts of your waste contamination, there's this notion of mandatory separation enforcement. So how do we do that? In an HDB flat where I live, or in some of the condos where some of my colleagues live, how do we do mandatory separation management?
So logistically, the way in which this is going to work is that each regional area or each apartment block will have the public waste collection companies monitor the waste that is being disposed. As they collect it, they will be able to monitor what goes in, and if there are problems with separation, they will impose fines through a two-stage warning system, and then finally the imposition of a fine. This provides a chance for people to both learn the process, as well as if it doesn't work, there is that enforceability mechanism. And the way it will be done practically is by charging this fee or fine to the whole apartment block. We are fostering a collegiate sense of everyone working together to reduce the amount of waste that they create.
So it's collective fine.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to pass the mic, but the one thing I was doing is I do seriously question the feasibility of such a system. And the one thing that I see, coming back to your point on sort of the packaging, is both this and the packaging bring up questions to me on the overall cost and the finances. How do we actually do this without stifling growth in Singapore if you're really talking about doing something like mandatory packaging management?
So currently Singapore has what's known as a sustainable packaging agreement, which is not binding. However, about 200 companies have currently signed up, and they've agreed to lower their packaging costs by a certain amount. And what that process found was that they ended up with cost savings of 44 million Singaporean dollars through forcing them to, I guess, think about things in a more innovative sense. So we would suggest that in this sense, the legislation wouldn't stifle growth in Singapore, but rather just encourage our industry to find more sustainable methods. And once more efficient methods of packaging are found, that will just deliver long-term cost savings, like what's been delivered in the Singapore packaging agreement.
My question is around what is the most important or serious risk you see to the waste to energy generation possibilities? Considering the fact that, in Singapore, our energy market and pool is already highly competitive. In fact, prices are dropping in the last few years. And with the increased incidence of availability of gas, including shale gas, etc., what do you think that would mean in terms of risk to waste to energy really being viable? Have you considered this? How much of a risk is it?
So your question is around, have we considered the dropping gas prices, etc., on the viability of this waste energy strategy? Yeah, so
Because I've not heard the risk element sufficiently in your presentation. I've heard the good story.
the key risk we see is actually not that. It's actually rather the inability, or rather inability or of private tenderers to go for the government tender. That's what we see as a key risk. And to mitigate that, we think the best way to do so is to go back. My colleague Kieran has talked about the alternative strategy, which is to work where there's a co-partnership, a PP, essentially a private-public partnership between government and a private business, where the government can essentially de-risk the project and also provide its balance sheet capabilities. On your specific point, we have considered the drop in domestic electricity prices, and because if a waste-to-energy generator begins selling energy and the price drops, then their business could be unviable if the price overall in the market also drops, like a spike, for example. We recommend that you enter into 10 to 15-year power purchase agreements. This is mandatory because it ensures longevity and cash flows into the future. What you have to do is ensure, essentially, a supply of waste going into this plant, and the output, the energy, will be bought up by the relevant counterparties.
Your presentation touched on key stakeholders, member firms. If I was a member firm, based on your analysis, I could save up to 20%, or I could pay 3% more. From a government perspective, after you've done your presentation to the board, the next thing you need to do is to convince the government to adopt what proposals you have. The government would look at it from a totality basis, which means private sector, and in addition to how much funding I'm going to be putting in. You have some numbers, you don't have any numbers here as to what the cost is going to require to roll something like this out. But I'm not asking for an answer here per se, but how would you go about quantifying whether it will be net beneficial to the Singapore economy and the private sector, less the funding cost?
So we've actually considered the role of government, given that they are a major stakeholder. So two key benefits that we thought from them, specifically with the economy, the one on the right with employment. There was a white paper released by your firm, CEASE, about 2 months ago, that discussed the significant benefits that an emerging green and sustainable sector would have on the Singaporean economy. And I can't remember the specific numbers off the top of my head, I can provide it to you afterwards. However, it was quite a significant benefit for the economy, especially given that the world as a whole is moving towards an increasingly sustainable sector. So we would say that given the extra employment benefits, the additional jobs in construction, high-level management, R&D, that would significantly boost the Singaporean economy in the long term.
I was shocked by the collective fine because John dumps everything in the bin and then I have to pay for it. So that's something I don't know how you will charge it, especially if people own their apartments. So I don't know. But okay, for me, what you have not really considered in mind, but maybe I've missed it, is the economic development. So take an example, India is going from a very low bottom, is investing a lot, people go to a middle class, etc., etc. Singapore is a step ahead, China is somewhere in between. How do you motivate people who have nothing, but who also create waste in countries like Singapore? How do you motivate them to come along? Because you can't charge them. They live in HDB flats. There's no money to be, so they are not keen to get an app and participate in this game. So I have a bit of the feeling it's very nice from a student point of view, from a middle class, upper middle class point of view, it looks great. But how is the average Singaporean or the average Korean going to be motivated to do this? Because not everybody has the same goal on let's get a clean environment.
Sorry, I might latch on to that question, which was mine, is sort of related to it. Look, the scenario is always about a growing economy. What if and when an economy is not growing or it stagnates? You know, and we've had the examples of that. Singapore used to be a fast-growing economy, now it's become steady state, right? It might even stagnate, we don't know. Then what happens to the whole strategy? Just like saying what he was saying about those countries.
So I'll deal with the first part of the question, so about the everyday Singaporean. And I guess what we found in our research is that Singaporeans actually do want to come on board with this recycling method. So the incentives are there to mobilise the entire national effort, but our research has actually shown that Singaporeans want to get involved in recycling. They just have an issue of the knowledge gap about how this is actually about to take place. By creating the scheme, we are nationalising the effort and we are mobilising people to work towards that greener future.